Welcome back. Let's see, now I want to welcome 3 panelists on stage. It's Shahan Lilja, CEO of Mavenoid. Do I have you with me? Not yet. Jon.
Yes.
Ekkono. Yeah, Shahan.
Hello.
Great, super, thank you. And how about Jon? Are you still online?
I'm here.
Yeah, fantastic. And Martin Rugfelt from Sentian.
Hello.
Oh, great. This is actually fantastic. I'm really impressed that this is even possible, I must admit. So super happy to have you. You are all 3 super experienced founders, and I've known you a couple of years now, and I also know that you're really successful in collaborating with large companies. You managed to start really interesting collaborations and also reached commercial rollout with quite a few of them. So I was thinking that we should have a session about how you actually start. And I know that we also been discussing this quite a lot. It's unfortunately, quite many of the large companies are still struggling with how they should do the first collaborations in order to actually build results, to be able to scale the results together with you as startups. Many of the pilot projects that we see, they actually stop after the pilot itself is over because they might not have a plan on how to scale it. And I know that you have a lot of ideas on this topic. So I have 3 questions for you during this panel. And please, we will also ask the audience, if you want to ask your questions, use the Q&A button. And we hope that we, during these 20 minutes, can make room for some of your questions as well. So my first question is actually, we must assume that the overall purpose of starting a pilot is to test something that you can then deploy and scale out together with the corporate, right? What are your best recommendations in designing the pilot to achieve the results that you can actually build something scalable upon? And I would like to start to ask Shahan.
So I guess we do 2 things. One of them is we create something called a project charter. And a project charter really is kind of our attempt to overinvest in the design of the pilot. And it basically it's a 1-pager. It's like takes 60 seconds to read. And it's basically, what's the purpose of this project? What are the goals? What are the stakeholders? What will different people do? It just contains that basic information that then becomes a live document that we refer to as the pilot goes on. And we are kind of religious about always doing these. We incorporate them even into our sales process to see that's kind of when we start to create it. We always try to make the customer be part of designing it. So we don't just like do it ourselves and then say this is the project charter, but it's very important to have multiple stakeholders on the customer side feel that they have created this artifact. So I think that's something we do. Maybe it sounds like a very simple thing, but we do it, I would say, quite in a disciplined way. We take it really seriously. And the other thing we do is that we are quite anal about not starting a pilot before we have involved exactly the roles that we need to involve for a particular company or our particular product. Exactly what those roles are is not very interesting for the purpose of your question, but unless like all those boxes are checked, we don't start.
You're on mute, Stina.
Martin, yeah. Good catch there. Would you say could you mention 1 or 2 specifics in this chart that you have found being more important?
Do you mean like items or?
Yeah, or tasks or commitments or
Yeah.
key
So
findings.
sure. So for us, it's purpose, goal, deliverables, timeline, stakeholders. That's it. And then we just map that out. And it's very important that it's not more than one page. Like we don't do a long action list. It's not a project plan. It's a project charter. And we use it actually both internally as well as with the customer. So like internally, it's often like, hey, what are the KPIs for this pilot really? Like, and then that kind of makes meetings and arguments much shorter. You can just refer to the project charter.
And is it any of these that are more difficult to get commitment from the larger companies on?
So it would be if we just like handed the project charter as like, written by us and just like, here's how we do our pilots. But we first do a free workshop with the customer, and the project charter is a outcome from that workshop. And so version 1 of the project charter actually comes from a workshop before we even sign a contract. And then we just say, look, this is how we do it at Mavenoid. This is how, the purpose of this is just to clarify what we really mean before proceeding. And there's other outcomes as well from the workshop, but version 0.1 of the project charter is one of them. And then once we actually finalize the project charter, then, Jack and John and Lisa and Anna, they've all been involved from the customer side in producing it. So it's really like they have created it as much as we have. We just provided the kind of the scaffolding. So that's kind of the frame of mind in which we use when we're creating these things.
Thank you. That's sounds like a very sound and good way also to get the commitment and involvement. So I would like to ask Martin, how does your process look like, or your best practice process, I would say?
Well, it is not too dissimilar from Shahan, what he has said. We do put a lot of effort in addition to that when it comes to the KPIs into how to measure them to make sure that we really understand each other and make sure that it is measurable, the results that we are targeting. Another one that I think is crucial is domain expertise. Securing that very early in the project, because there's often a lot of knowledge that is within their local environment, the customer's local environment, that is crucial for the success of the project. And in cases where the domain expert has not been allocated sufficiently to the projects, they often fail. Well, there's always a risk that they will fail unless you can make them actually get into the project. So I think that's a learning to be shared, that make sure that domain expertise is available for the projects. Then data is always crucial. So we make an effort to early on in the discussions with the customer get our hands on at least data samples. So that's to validate that there is sufficient data for what they are talking about and what they are aiming for. Then obviously realizing that these projects are often exploratory to some part, that the customer may not exactly know what they want, and that's all fine. This is often breaking new ground, and incorporating that in workshops so that that can be established, and making sure that you get onto the same page reasonably early in the project, well, very early in the project. And I think these are some of the core things that I think are important even before you really get into starting. So we make sure that we have sufficiently workshops to establish this, and then we put this on paper before we can get started.
Thank you very much, Martin. I would like to invite Jon also to share your best practices. What's the most important factors that you see to make a pilot a success?
Well, I think first and foremost, we need to work on a real problem. There's a tendency to get a bit overexcited about new technology like AI, and it kind of becomes AI for the sake of AI. At the end of the day, it's just another tool that's going to help them with solving real problems. Without a real problem, it's going to be very hard to prove if you really get things done. So just like Shahan and Martin, we also have a process. We use something called CRISP DM that starts with business understanding, where you put the spotlight on what is the problem that we're trying to solve? How do we solve it today? What are kind of the key success metrics and so forth? So everyone's aligned on really trying to address a real problem, because too often companies start from the perspective of data, that here's a bunch of data, what can we find in the data? And that's not going to take you anywhere. So you need to tee up for success, you need to drive it forward. And if you get focused on a real project where the POC is not an end in itself, but you actually focus on the rollout, that's where it gets interesting. Then you also get the right people involved, because then you're going to have the stakeholders who care about the new functionality that's going to go into my product or whatever it might be that impacts their daily business. So I think that's extremely important, that you keep the right focus on problems and on the rollout rather than just doing tire kicking.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings me to my actually next question. When in this process are you also starting to discuss the business case? I mean, the problem you actually can solve is, of course, a crucial part of that. But when do you start to discuss about revenue models, licensing models, and so on? Is it at all important in the start of a pilot?
If I may, yes. I mean, it always kicks up. That's something that comes into discussion quite early, and then it's usually quite often lost after a little while. I think it is important to discuss it, because it should be part of the KPIs really, or at least the goal setting. Because if we're talking about getting out of the POC swamp where a lot of AI projects get stuck, business case is crucial. So you have to take yourself to the next level by making sure there is a goal that is financial too, and that the people that are relevant for that business case are engaged with this project. So I see it as a key success factor to have included that in the goals.
Jon, do you have any take on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the customers' business model is definitely something that you have to take head on. Back to what I said before of addressing a real problem, because otherwise it's just going to be tire kicking. We even go as far as saying that we should talk about who's going to sell this, because there's a world of a difference in how you specify if something works, how you specify something as a success, unless you really know what's going to be used for. And there's a big difference if this is going to be sold as an add-on to an existing product, to brownfield deployments, or if it's just going to go with new deployments in greenfield, if this is going to be sold as a service, if it's going to be sold as the packaged product. I mean, all these different things impact how you actually deliver the solution. And unless you know where it's going to go and where you're going to take it, it's pretty useless to define if it's a successful POC or not. And the whole purpose of a POC is to get validation that, yes, this works. Now we can proceed into doing the real thing. And then you have to know what the real thing is.
That's great conclusion. I think talking about data and business models, I think there's something quite interesting in both of those aspects when starting a pilot specifically connected to AI. I know that Martin, you and I have been talking about this earlier, but I mean, the data, you said that it's important to get some data sets. My impression is that often the data sets that a corporate allows a startup to test with might not be the most important data sets. What are your advices on that? What type of data do you have to invest as a corporate to actually succeed?
I think that touches on two questions. One is the one you said, but the other one is startups and trust. Some big companies are not used to working with startups and may not trust them fully, and thinking that this is sort of a special breed of companies, which to a certain extent it is. However, they're also very, very filled up by the opportunity of working with large companies and are taking that extremely seriously. So trust shouldn't really be an issue, but it sometimes is, in which case they may not share this kind of data that is relevant at the first stage. And that's a mistake, obviously, because the whole point of sharing data is to validate that there is patterns in the data and it's readable and the quality and so on. Mm-hmm. So it is important to share that kind of data. And it's also important to share more information about it. We've had cases where we received data samples and they said, we have a lot more data. In fact, we have huge amounts of data in addition to this. And when we actually got that data later on, it just turned out to be another sort of copy of what they already given us, that there was no more variation in the data, which then turned the whole project upside down in terms of volumes. And these kind of questions are important for the startup partner to know. So that in itself then needs to be connected to the goals that you're achieving. That if you don't have if you haven't given the data that is necessary to solve the problems, well, you're gonna not reach these goals in the end.
And we actually have. I'm always happy to talk with you, and I could probably sit on for hours, but we have some questions from the audience. So Maria, I would like to ask you to address them.
Yes, can we really briefly just, any tips from moving from a pilot to a rollout?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Any tips from moving from the pilot, we discussed a pilot, to really roll it out? I know that we have some great examples of rolling out globally that Stina mentioned earlier.
So if I can give a quick comment to that, back to what I said before, I think that a POC or a pilot should be an integral part as a part of a project. It shouldn't be a standalone thing where you come to a stop and then you look for another go. It should be a validation on the way to solving a real problem. So that shouldn't be really a question. The question should be around, what does it take to actually roll this out as a feature in this machine, in this vehicle, whatever it might be. And on the way, you're going to have to do a POC or a pilot to validate that, yes, this works, and yes, the technology is up to spec and expectations. And the thing should be that at that point, at that gate, you either exit or you just proceed. So it shouldn't really be a question on how. That should be the project plan, that you should go towards a rollout, where the pilot or a POC is just one step on the way.
So just to clear things up, it's all about discussing that all the way in the starting of the pilot.
Yes, that the focus should be on the end product and the problem you're trying to solve, rather than the POC or a pilot being an end in itself.
Yes.
And if we add to that, that means that you have to have a good process for testing and learning from that first pilot, and also having secured projects for then maybe fixing those issues that may have arisen, so that you can scale it. But you also have to add then the training and all of those other components. And yes, because you're working with a startup, doesn't mean that you can go and think that everything should be extremely cheap. It's going to cost, just as it does when you're rolling things out with bigger companies. You have to have the training, you have to have the processes put in place, and you have to have the support that is necessary for these. And that can maybe sometimes be forgotten, that one thinks that these will solve themselves.
Yeah, and continuing on that, Martin, it's one other question is about the thing being cheap, or actually startups maybe wanting to validate the new business model and are doing pilots for free, like paid or unpaid pilots. Any comments on that? If what about the pricing of really having that common mindset?
Well, the first thing is to remember that AI technology has, compared to building something that can do the same thing with traditional technology, it is generally speaking a cheaper way of doing things. So it has a cost benefit compared to older generations of technology. When it comes to startups giving away things for free, well, I think they're shooting themselves in the foot. Now, they don't prove the value to the organization they're selling it to, and that's just a mistake. They should charge for it. Then you have a business model where you have to sometimes be smart too, but in generally speaking, you should charge for your project. And so I guess these are the two real comments to that. Yeah.
Mm.
Can I just throw in one sentence very quickly? Because I think that I fully respect when you actually give something away for free, or if you discount something because you need validation of technology. I've done that in previous companies where you actually need to get into a live environment to validate the product and the technology, but not when it comes to validating the business model. That's extremely contradictory, that you cannot validate the business model by giving things away for free. So I think that it kind of makes sense that you always charge for something that is adding value to the customer.
Good point.
Good point. Thank you so much. Stina, anything more to add, or are you about to close your panel discussion?
I think we need to close the panel discussion, and I just wanted to have chance. I know that you already from the beginning was very, very good at least get something paid from your customers, right?
Yeah, I guess the one thing I would add to the former two gentlemen's explanations, which I thought were really good, is that we use as a forcing function to define what happens after the pilot in the contracts. So our customers always had the opportunity to bail out after the pilot if we didn't provide the value we said we're going to do. But if they didn't explicitly cancel the contracts, they turned into a license model. And that was our actual revenue model, which is still our revenue model today. Mm. And the nice thing about that is that if you have someone on the customer side who is not really interested in the problem you're actually solving, then they kind of will kick back and push back more on that type of structure of the agreement. Mm. So you kind of forced, if you forbid yourself to sign a contract that's just a pilot, you're forced to speak to the real problem owner instead of a innovation officer who gets promoted based on the number of projects they run, for example.
Great takeaways. And I think it summarizes also the very philosophy that Ignite is always preaching, that if you can solve a real problem, you should also get, of course, paid for solving that. Otherwise, as a startup, you never know that it's bringing some real value in the end.